The government continues to defend its attempt to introduce a tax on KiwiSaver fees, then ditching it 24 hours later after public backlash. While it won't go ahead now, the decision-making process behind it not featuring in a press release about the tax changes is not yet clear. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern joins us this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Prime Minister, when you got the Cabinet papers ahead of this omnibus tax bill, did at any point when you were going through them or in Cabinet meeting itself, did you think this bit about the KiwiSaver GST fees could be a bit contentious?
Oh, well, ultimately we knew there were mixed views on it, it's fair to say, because, of course, the changes that were being proposed would affect some but not others, because some were already applying GST, and those tended to be, as we were advised, smaller operators, those more likely to be New Zealand-based. So we knew that there would be some who would be opposed, but we were also told there would be some in favour. But look, the reaction demonstrated that even though we believed we were evening up the playing field for operators, very clear from the sector that they didn't view it that way, and so that's why we moved very quickly.
Who was in favour of it? How many people were in favour?
Oh, well, so there was when I say public consultation out with those whom it affected in October of 2020, Melissa, and so that was the basis on which IRD were coming back and saying to us, well, based on that, and they articulated as smaller providers, so those New Zealand-based providers, for instance, whereas those larger fund managers who are able to organise themselves in such a way that they were not applying GST to their fees, of course, they were viewed as the ones who would be less likely to be in favour. So whilst I can't give you numbers, that was broadly the way it was described to ministers.
But they have since changed their mind too, the smaller providers?
Look, based on the feedback that we were seeing publicly, there were some who I would have thought potentially, for instance, may have been in favour who clearly weren't, and our view was we don't want to risk undermining KiwiSaver. It's very important to us as a Labour government. We were the ones that introduced it, and we've been very, very clear around our view on it going into the future and its place in New Zealand, but that was one of the reasons we made the decision to ditch these changes.
OK, so the consultation began October 2020. When you were going through the papers and in the Cabinet meeting, you knew that there would be mixed views, yet the press release had no mention of it at all. Why is that when clearly, as you're saying, you knew there would be contentious opinion, it would be contentious?
There was some in favour, some opposed. So look, ultimately it was, as you described it. Yeah, indeed. Well, look, as you've described, it was an omnibus bill. So there, even though the whole thing was released, so everything was put out, but what you're talking about is just the covering press statement by the minister. He was, of course, making judgments over those things that would be of the most public interest. Look, it should have been included. There are a number of other things included it should have been, so I'm not going to argue with that.
Did you see that press release before it went out?
I don't believe I did, but that's neither here nor there, Melissa. I think ultimately, we all agree now that it should have been.
I mean, what
at
people
the same
want
time,
to know was it deliberately left off?
The whole thing was released, though, just to be clear. Everything was put out. This was just the covering press statement.
It was, but when it's put out in a big bundle for the public and not kind of pointed out as one of the key features, it could be seen as hiding it.
Not the intention. As I say, this is something IRD started work on in 2017. It was consulting on with those affected, and as I say, I believe it was October 2020. So no, not at all. And keeping in mind, for some fund managers, so this is a GST charged on service fees. So it was characterised as being on all contributions by some. That wasn't the case. So highly relevant to fund managers. Some who are already applying it, for instance. But look, ultimately, I'm not going to disagree with you because we've moved away from the policy and there's good reason for that. When
you say that it's a tax on the fee, do you run the risk, though, of insulting public intelligence and that they know that then gets passed on to them, which is then wiped off their KiwiSaver accounts? No, not at all. The only reason I point that out is because I saw in the early stages of the debate that clarification and some of the characterisation of it wasn't captured at first glance. So no, not at all, just reflecting some of the early coverage that I saw of it. Okay, so on the same day that the government then was dealing with the PR fallout, I guess you could say, of the KiwiSaver GST fee tax, on that day, the Minister of Disabled People contacted their providers and said, right, you've got 24 hours, come back with us on what you think we should do about mask mandates. This is your consultation, you've got 24 hours. Was that consultation brought forward for any reason? Is there a reason it was so quickly called for?
I got asked about this, and to be fair, I don't know if it was the minister or the ministry, but look, for those who are being asked, it probably is neither here nor there. I got asked about this on Friday. It struck me as being a bit curious because we haven't made final decisions on mask use. And of course, we've long signalled that we would be looking at all of our settings. The last time we made the did a setting review, which was weeks ago, and so it was always scheduled that we would do that in September. So there's not really a good reason for there to have been such a tight turnaround for those of interest. But one thing I would say that we know, we're very aware of the concerns of our immunocompromised Kiwis, New Zealanders with disabilities, over the use of masks and COVID protections generally. So that is something that we are very, very aware of. Obviously, the Ministry for Disabled People's gone out and done its own outreach. But again, the timeframes for that didn't feel very reasonable to me, and ultimately that's feedback that we'll be giving them.
There are a number of people, though, out and about, I think, undeniably you would say, who aren't following the mask rules in any case. Has the government lost control of public compliance?
No, I wouldn't say that. Look, one of the things that we're very mindful of is that the public do the same thing that we do, and that is track and keep an eye on what's happening with cases, the prevalence of COVID. And we know that sometimes we'll be making judgments on their own compliance with the rules. That is not a reason to not have them, but it is something that we keep in mind. How much are we seeing those rules be followed? But as I say, it's something we think about, but it's not the primary basis of those decisions. We will be, as I've indicated though, at the next review, looking at all of our settings, making sure that we're keeping in mind those settings that are most needed to continue to keep people safe as we continue to manage COVID-19.
And so what is the date for people to know the outcome of that review?
Final decisions aren't being taken this week. It'll be next week.
Okay. Now, last week, we spoke with you about work visas, and it was specifically around addressing shortages in the hospitality sector in Queenstown. Just a wee reminder of what you spoke about then.
And I'm now starting to see come through, because this was a recent change, actually the individuals coming in and filling roles, and they include cooks and chefs and so on. And so here, all I could say, Ryan, is I am interested in those personal experiences because this was designed to be simpler and easier. For instance, 100 cooks had already were coming through that system, and then there were chefs on top of that as well.
So, Prime Minister, have you since heard of those personal experiences and advised on any tweaks that do need to be changed around those settings?
Yeah, so I saw one of the examples last week, I believe, around a chef where there was a disagreement of whether or not they met the qualifications in order to come into New Zealand. It struck me as an unusual example. So I have spoken with the Minister of Immigration. I just think we need to go back and just double check that, particularly for that sector, because we know there's a lot of pressure there. That's working as we would expect. We are seeing the job ads coming through. We are seeing then the individual visas being processed. But I do want to just do a little check because that example stood out to me a little bit.
Yeah, you say disagreement. Julie White, Hospitality NZ CEO, who we had earlier, called it a policy out of step with reality, saying, and this was something that Mountain Scene reported in Queenstown, one resort wanted to bring in a chef who'd had a decade of experience, 3 years culinary school, a chef de partie at 2 international hotels, so it's about as senior as you can get. And yet they didn't
that's the example I believe I saw.
Yeah, so they didn't fit the qualification we had here, which is for aspiring
chefs. So there's some areas where you'll have qualifications that they'll then try and match to the equivalent of New Zealand qualifications, and I think that's where this issue has arisen. So I am going to ask Immigration New Zealand to just go and check that we've got the settings right there, because we do know that we've got pressure in that part of the system. One other thing, though, that I think I'll just add, for the hospitality sector, we know that working holiday visas, less so for chefs and cooks, but generally working holiday visas for the hospitality sector make a big difference. We have over 25,000 working holiday visas that have been issued. The issue has been people actually taking them up and coming into New Zealand. We're starting to see that change. 800 entered into the country last week alone. So that's giving us, in 1 week alone, so that's giving us an indication that now that summer, we're moving into the new season in New Zealand and out of summer for the rest of other parts of the world where those visa holders come from, that represents a positive opportunity for New Zealand.
And that is one, I guess, source of employees, which will fill cooks, but for professional chefs, just going back to what you said, will that be a change?
Totally acknowledge that.
That will be a change? You will advise that needs to change?
As I say, well, actually, I think it's not so much whether the settings are right, it's whether they're being applied correctly. I think that's the issue. So that's what I've asked Immigration New Zealand to go and look at. But the final thing to acknowledge, Melissa, is unlike other parts of our immigration system, we've actually given carve-outs for hospitality so that they don't have to reach, for instance, the same median income requirements, median wage requirements as other sectors, because we recognise there's so much pressure in that system. So we are trying to ease that pressure. I want to go and check if it's working in this particular area, though.
Okay, I just want to talk finally about gangs. A Headhunters member recently posted on social media calling on members not to vote National because they were planning to crack down on gangs. Do you want gang members to vote for Labour?
You know, Melissa, here I would say if there is somehow an argument that we are not going to take crime and victimisation and community safety seriously in order to garner votes, I just find that a reprehensible position. Of course not. And in fact, one of the things that I would point out is that under this government, we have increased the number of police officers. We are increasing the number of tools that are available to police. And today, we're adding some additional tools, particularly on organised crime. So the idea that somehow we are the party of favour for gangs, I would just, I would push back on that very hard.
Yeah, I don't know whether anybody is suggesting that. It was just that the Headhunters member was saying, don't vote for National. There's going to be an announcement around that.
Do you know what I would say?
Gangs?
Don't join a gang. Ultimately, if you don't want to be worried about, what a political party represents for you, actually don't engage in the victimisation of New Zealanders. Don't, intimidate our communities. Don't recruit young people. That's actually what I would want to see being promoted more widely, rather than how gangs vote.
Finally, Prime Minister, did Clark get anything special for Father's Day yesterday?
He was actually working, so Neve picked him some flowers and sent him a video. So it was quite
lovely.
Cute.
Oh, very nice. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, appreciate your time. Thanks for being with us on AM this morning.